Now I'm going to read chapter 8 of A Day of Rest, and things are beginning to get a little bit more exciting. So, A Day of Rest by Edna Creekmore Carmen, and the picture that goes along with this chapter is of our little Susan facing down a cow. Chapter 8. Susan was ready to go home, but Bert sat staring at the marbles in the center of a circle drawn in the dirt. The same hypnotic stare was on the faces of the other boys kneeling around the circle or standing watching as they leaned against the school wall. Only the boy kneeling next to Bert showed any animation, with his teeth clamped over his lower lip. The boy placed his knuckles on the line and aimed his marble at the clump of marbles in the center of the circle. A long, drawn-out sigh from Bert acknowledged the boy's hit of a favorite glassy. The sigh was followed by a joyous crow of satisfaction as none of the marbles hit cleared the circle. Bert shifted until his weight was on his right knee and then placed his hand with his steely on the line. Bert aimed and shot. The heavy steely propelled a lighter marble out of the ring. Bert shot again and again. Susan didn't think she would be able to get Bert to leave as long as he was winning, so she moved over to stand beside Jim Weaver, who was leaning against the wall of the schoolhouse. It was cooler standing up in the shade. However, the boys scuffling around in the dry dirt made the dust rise and get in her nose. Susan tried breathing through her mouth to keep the dust out of her nose, but that only made her mouth dry. There was water in a bucket on the front porch of the school. As Susan looked longingly at the bucket of water, the sides glistening with drops of condensed water, a girl sitting on one of the benches stood up and walked up to the bucket and picked up the dipper. "Bert, can I get a drink?" Susan nudged Bert to get his attention. Jim Weaver shook his head even as Bert answered. "You know Dad don't want you to drink anywhere but at home." Bert objected as he moved around the circle to get a better aim at a red glassy. "But I'm hot." "Wait until I'm through," Bert growled. "We'll go home." "I'm hot now," Susan said stubbornly, "and I'm thirsty now." "I have to go," Bert said hurriedly to the other boys and grabbed his marbles from the center of the circle before anyone could object. Then, on second thought, he dropped some of the marbles he had just knocked out of the circle back into the ring. "Coming, Jim?" Bert asked as he grabbed Susan's arm and began pushing her over to the side of the audience. "You might as well go with us." "I'll tell Ma," Jim answered before he hurried back through the seated audience to where Mrs. Weaver sat. Jim caught up with Bert and Susan as they reached the edge of the road. Bert dropped Susan's arm and darted across the gravel road to the ditch on the other side. Jim followed close behind. Without a glance backward to see if Susan was following, the two boys ran along the ditch. Susan, pounding along the tracks in the center of the road, was falling farther and farther behind. Suddenly, as Bert passed a wooden gate blocking an entrance to a cornfield, he swerved to his right, climbing the first two planks of the gate, and then swung his body up and over. He landed on his feet and disappeared among the yellow stalks of corn. Jim, determined to not let the younger boy get out of sight, followed immediately. "Bert! Bert! I'm supposed to go straight home," Susan yelled. "This is straight home, dummy." Bert's reply came from the depths of the cornfield. "We go straight through the cornfield, straight through the woods, straight through the garden, and straight home." As a clincher, Bert added, "It'll be a lot cooler going through the woods." Even though Susan was sure that Aunt Mary wouldn't approve of her climbing gates with her new fit dress on, she stopped only a second at the base of the gate to look at the black and yellow butterflies darting back and forth between the weeds growing along the fence, and finally coming to rest on the brilliant orange flowers growing against the post, before she put her bare feet on the rough boards forming the gate. Succeeding to climb to the top of the gate without tearing her dress or getting splinters in her hands or feet from the rough weathered planks of the gate, Susan paused as she straddled the top plank of the gate. Bert and Jim were nowhere in sight. She could see nothing in the field but yellow corn stalks, stalks taller even than her dad. Only a beaten dirt path indicated where the two boys might have gone. "Come on, Susan," Bert shouted from the depths of the cornfield. "You know where this is. You have been here plenty of times hoeing corn." Susan started to obey, but out in the field, off to the left, nearer than the sound of Bert's voice, there was a sharp, ripping, tearing sound accompanied by the clatter of a cow's bell, the young Jersey's. Susan would know that sound anywhere. She didn't have to see the yellow cow to know that the cow was feeding on the corn stalks remaining after the ears had been harvested. Off to the right, a jingling tinkling of a sheep bell. Concentrating on the hidden depth of the field, Susan thought she could see the tan and white form of Girly Guernsey. "Bert! Bert!" There was no response. Reluctantly, Susan jumped from the gate and began running along the footpath between the stalks of corn, with her hands stretched out in front of her face to catch the sawing edges of the corn leaves. She had left behind the ringing tones of the cast sheep bell that hung on Girly Guernsey's neck, when up ahead Old Red's bell began to clang. Straight in front of Susan, right in the path, the head of the red pole cow was thrust between the tassels of corn. Steadily chewing, the cow swung her head to get a clear view of Susan. Susan stopped. Old Red, the herd boss, had no horns, but she didn't need horns to knock a person or a cow out of her way. And there was Old Red peering at her through the stalks of corn. The large liquid black eyes with the long black eyelashes looked innocently at Susan. The upward tilt of the head and the forward thrust of the ears seemed to show merely curiosity, but Susan hesitated. She would not dispute right-of-way with Old Red. "Susan, won't you come on?" Bert demanded from the other side of the cow. "You said you wanted to go home." "Old Red is in my way," Susan yelled back. "Fraidy cat, that cow won't hurt you," Bert scolded, before delivering a resounding slap accompanied by a gruff "move over" to the shoulder of Old Red. The cow edged her feet out of the path, but moved her head very little. At the command, "Come on, Susan," from Bert, Susan crept past the bulging sides of the cow. Just as she breathed a sigh of relief, Old Red swung her head forward and down, and the rough tongue curled around Susan's bare arm. "Oh!" Susan squealed as she jumped out of reach of the tongue. Then, pell-mell, not daring to look back at Old Red, whose bell jangled behind her, Susan darted forward along the path through the tall jungle of corn. A fence with an open gate bordered the edge of the cornfield. Again, Bert was nowhere in sight, but a path led into the forest beyond. Hurriedly, Susan closed the gate and fastened it just as the lumbering form of Old Red cleared the stalks of corn. Breathing a sigh of relief, Susan looked at Old Red as the cow trotted forward. The gate would stop the cow, but she would feel safer in the trees. At the edge of the forest, Susan paused before stepping cautiously into the cool, moist path. Just killing time, no longer afraid, Susan looked back at the wooden gate where Old Red stood with her head thrust over the wooden planks. For a long interval, the cow and the girl stared at each other. Then the cow swung her head around and walked back into the stalks of corn. Susan turned and walked farther into the woods. Far ahead, she could hear bare feet padding down the dirt path going down the hill. "Wait for me, Bert," she yelled. Far ahead, she heard Bert's reply, "Come on, Slowpoke." Instead of hurrying, Susan stopped. Bert was just showing off for Jim. She would stay here a while at the edge of the trees and let him wait. While waiting for her eyes to adjust to the dim light beneath the trees, Susan stood so still that a gray squirrel in a hickory tree came out of his hole and scampered along a limb. The squirrel was at the edge of the branch reaching for a nut that grew on a twig above his head when he saw the girl standing on the path below. The squirrel paused, his black beady eyes staring unblinkingly at Susan. Then he began to scold in chittering barks. Susan laughed at the thought of that little squirrel thinking it could drive anyone as big as she was away. The limbs of the trees met overhead, forming a shadowy tunnel. The floor of the forest was carpeted by leaves with only the center of the path beaten bare. Susan left the path, swinging her feet wide, listening to the swishing rattle of the large, brittle, fan-shaped leaves. She pressed her bare feet on the leaves, causing the brown shapes to crackle to dust. The fan-shaped leaves came from a low-hanging limb just above her head. Susan jumped, trying to pull the limb down, but it was far beyond her reach. Little round balls dangling from clusters of the leaves taunted Susan as she jumped again. She picked up a fallen branch and tried to hook the limb. Again, no success. She might as well give up and go on. Bert would have had time to begin to wonder where she was by then. And that's the end of chapter 8. I wonder what's going to happen in the woods.